Hello, everyone. Welcome to week number 9, lecture guide number 7 on early Jewish and Christian arts. This is a little bit shorter lecture than the last two, which on Greece and Rome, took a number of different videos to cover the entire period or the entire kind of group of works of art that we wanted to get to in those. So we've got a little bit less to cover this time, but it sets the groundwork for a number of things that are going to show up in Byzantine arts in particular, and even sets up some of the ideas that will show up in our last lectures on Islamic arts as well. So even though there's less material, we're going to go into that in a little bit greater depth than we might otherwise go into these things this week. So let's get a little bit of history again. We're looking at Roman Empire here in the map around the 4th century so that you can see the spread of this. Obviously, we're here, the center of everything is in Rome, but the Roman Empire controls all of this area up to Britain, through Spain, through most of North Africa, and into the Middle East, where we'll be covering. So last time we talked about some changes that occurred in the beginning of the end of the 3rd, beginning of the 4th century around Constantine the Great, issuing, for instance, the Edict of Milan, which forbade any kind of religious persecution, including predominantly the persecution of Christians during this time. Within about 100 years, Christianity will be the official state religion of Rome. But at the same time period, what happens is that Rome itself, here in Italy, is not a very stable place. And so Constantine, based upon the earlier ideas that were put in place under the Tetrarchy, moves another center of Rome over into modern-day Istanbul, over here, if you follow my cursor, in what is known as Constantinople at the time. And this will be the major center of the Christian church through the Byzantine era and through the entire kind of remainder of our course. So we'll be looking at some areas around Rome, which are fairly stable through the 5th century, and then it collapses. And then, we'll pick this up again in a week or two over in Constantinople and look at the Byzantine Empire. So basic ideas here. Number one, if you don't know much about Christianity, you should look up some basic ideas, and I will set up a discussion forum to help kind of generate more information on basic kind of Christian ideas. But let's set some things out from the very start. Number one, for Christians who have adopted, of course, all of the Judaic ideas listed in the Old Testament, which, of course, Judaism starts this whole thing out, going back probably at least till around 3000 BCE, although the main centers around the area that is contemporary Israel and Palestine don't really get stable until the 2nd century BCE, and then, of course, the Roman Empire takes over that part of the area. In any case, Christians and Muslims as well all derive their religion from Judaic ideas that go back the furthest. But for the Christians, the Judaic text, known as for Christians as the Old Testament, books that start with Genesis and Exodus and so forth, are simply kind of foreshadowings of the arrival of their Messiah, Jesus Christ. For Jews, Jesus Christ is one of a long series of prophets who show up to preach the word of God. And the same is believed by Muslims, that Christ is a prophet among many others who preaches the word of God. For Christians, however, he's not just a prophet, he is the Messiah. He is the Christ, which literally means he is God on earth. He is God made human through the form of Jesus, coming through the mother, the Virgin Mary, to fix a number of things, to lead us, to guide us during a time that, in which humanity is deemed to be in great turmoil. So that's one of the fundamental ideas of Christianity, that Jesus Christ, unlike what the Jews and the Muslims think, is more than just a prophet. He is God incarnate on earth in human form to help guide us. He guides us, of course, through his own sermons during his lifetime, but he also establishes a group of followers known as the 12 Apostles, and these are the first religious leaders. Most dominantly, Peter, one of the apostles. St. Peter becomes, as we'll see when we look at St. Peter's in Rome, the first bishop of Rome, the first major leader of the religion in Rome, and becomes the kind of progenitor, the main authority for the popes in Rome and frankly the religious leaders over in Constantinople as well. Jesus lives his life, and when he is 33, 34 years old, he is imprisoned by the Romans at the bequest, according to the Bible, of the Jews. He is charged basically with incitement and believing that he is the king of the Jews, and he is crucified, nailed to a cross in order to execute him for these crimes. For Christians, however, that execution, because he is the Son of God, because one believes if he is God, he could have stopped it, he allows this to occur. For Christians, this is the ultimate martyrdom, a religious figure who dies for their beliefs. And in the case of Jesus, he dies in order to wipe away original sin, which is something that occurs in the Garden of Eden, which I'll get to when we get to some of these images there. In other words, Christ sacrifices himself, or God sacrifices his only Son, Christ, so as to allow the rest of us, believing Christians, if that's what your religion is, to get into heaven and have everlasting life. So what's going on in Rome during the same time as the rise of Christianity through the first, second, and third centuries AD or CE? Number one, there are many, many religions, as I said last time, existing side by side, many of which are devoted to the idea of monotheism, but more of which are devoted to the idea of salvation. If you think of the way that a Christian would view the world, it's a pretty tough place for a lot of people. And Christianity gives this promise of another world, the world of heaven and divine grace and bliss, that all of us will be able to live if we follow the ideas of Christianity, if we're good Christians and we practice Christianity. And so this has a kind of promise to it. The other side of Christianity that is so persuasive through this period is that it creates communities around shared belief of people gathering together and speaking about, after all, religion is a kind of encapsulation of one's worldview, speaking about the type of world and the type of people they want to be. So at the same time, in early Rome, there are religions such as Judaism, Christianity, Mithraism, Manichaeism, Gnosticism, and many, many others, including, of course, the Roman traditions going back to the Greeks about the Olympian gods and the sun gods and so forth. The idea of salvation is key to Christianity. Christianity spreads through the Gospels, and most of you who are Christians know that in the New Testament, which is the Christian form of the Bible, the Old Testament is the adaptation of Judaic text. In the New Testament, there are 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are being spread at this time, along with as many as 30 other Gospels that never made it into the New Testament when it was codified in the 5th century or end of the 4th century by the Romans. In other words, there are a lot of Gospels out there, and then when the Romans basically canonize or make legitimate various texts, they only pick 4 of those Gospels. It is worth knowing, too, historically, that those Gospels were primarily in oral form that weren't written down until, at least 70 years after the death of Christ. And in some cases, we believe that they are being modified all the way up until the 4th century when they're codified as the Christian New Testament. So At the same time period, of course, in the 3rd century, Constantine is consolidating power. He's promoting, at least implicitly, Christianity. He starts to build structures based upon Christian beliefs in both Jerusalem, which we won't look at, but in Rome and in areas around Rome as well, which of course gives a big bump to Christianity. He believes, and this is where religion and politics always get imbricated in one another, that a king or an emperor rules by the decree of God, that it's kind of divinely ordained. And by the way, this is an idea that the Romans believed not through the Christian God, but through other gods, giving them their authority as well. And let's kind of get on with the show here and look at some of these images. We're going to start this week with images basically related to Christian burial practices, which were, of course, very important. But we start here just by showing you that these traditions come from earlier, just straightforward Roman pagan traditions. You're looking at a work here that is known as the sarcophagus with the Battle of the Romans and the barbarians on it. A sarcophagus, for those of you who don't know, is an above ground burial casket, usually made out of stone, and in this case, richly carved with reliefs. And as the Romans, who formerly had practiced cremation, start to move into the belief of Christianity, they begin to practice inhumation, or the burial of the full body. This is important for Christians because Christians believe that the body, and this is not so dissimilar, although it's not as firm, frankly, it's not so dissimilar than the idea of the Egyptians and the Ka. The Christians believe that the body is the house to the soul, and so preserving that body, at least until the soul has kind of ascended to heaven or left the body to some liminal place while awaiting judgment. Later on, they'll call this purgatory, for instance, is really important. So you can't burn that body yet. You have to bury it in one way or another. And sarcophagi, which go all the way back to, frankly, Egyptian caskets like those that we saw in Tutankhamun, are a favorite way of inhuming the body, especially for rich patrons. Now, what you're looking at here, we're not going to go into in detail, but it's the basic idea of the triumph of the Romans over all of the people that seek to do them harm, and probably the man in the middle here is the person for whom this sarcophagus was made, who was a Roman general or something of that sort. This is just a close-up of that as well. Move to look at some very, very early adoptions of Christian ideas or Christian imagery in the sarcophagi. What you're looking at here is a sarcophagus from Santa Maria Antica from around 270 CE, I'm sorry, 270 CE, so the 3rd century CE, made out of marble, in which we see some basic kind of Christian ideas carved into the surface of this. Right in the middle of this whole thing, you see a figure who is, reading a text. It's not clear who this is, but we believe this is likely to have been the person who was buried in this sarcophagus. Off to the right-hand side, what will become an incredibly familiar figure to you is the Good Shepherd. Now, the Good Shepherd comes from a passage in the Bible, and it's referred to all through the Bible itself, in which, for instance, in Psalm 23 of the Old Testament, it says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." So this is the basic idea, now in a symbolic form of a man carrying on his back a ram or a sheep, of God being our shepherd, or more specifically, Christ being the shepherd, and we are his flock. Now, they don't depict Christ very often early on, partially because some of you know that the Old Testament has what are called the Ten Commandments, tablets of the law that were given to Moses by God on Mount Sinai, telling them kind of the 10 cardinal rules of Judaic belief. These all get adopted by Christians later on. But the second commandment warns against worshiping false idols. And idols are considered to be any kind of manifestation or depiction of a god in figurative form that might be mistaken as God and worshipped. And this is why, for instance, that Jews, more often than not, although there are plenty of exceptions to this, tend not to represent figurative forms or certainly they don't represent their God in human form, and tend to shy away from any other kinds of figurative forms. Christians slowly began to develop the depiction of their saints and Jesus and other, even God at times, in their own art. But even then, it's a little bit of a hit and miss situation. Every once in a while, and we'll come across this in later lectures, there will be moments where people will firmly believe that the depiction of Jesus or any saints, and in particular God, runs counter to the second commandment against creating graven images or creating idols, false idols to be worshipped. And they will destroy art that represents those types of images. So in this case, what I'm getting at is that you depict a figure who is symbolically the same as Christ, the Good Shepherd, without naming it as Christ. And that tradition, as we'll see, goes, by the way, this depiction of a man holding over his shoulders a ram or a sheep or a goat, or even a calf or any kind of animal, has a very, very deep tradition going back to early animal sacrifices that were sacrificed on altars and offered up to the gods of many different religions. In Christianity as well, that ram or that sacrificial animal is meant to refer to Christ. Christ dies for our sin. He sacrifices himself for us. And so this whole thing is caught up in the idea of Christ as our shepherd, Christ as someone who sacrifices himself for our salvation, and so forth. Off to the other side over here, on this side, you see a scene of a baptism. Over here, we see a man over the top of another man who probably is baptizing him. Baptism is a form of purification for Christians in which someone is washed in holy water and it cleanses them of their sins. During the early time of Christianity, baptism, believe it or not, was not practiced necessarily on young people. Many, especially Romans, practiced it right at the end of their life, kind of hedging their bets, it seems to me, like you may have committed some sins, but then you atone for those sins, and right at the end of your life, you get baptized so as to make yourself pure and be received into heaven. On the other side, we see Jonah and the whale, although the whale, once again, we'll see this over and over again, looks suspiciously unlike a whale. It may be a sea dragon. There was a mistranslation, this happens a lot, from the Old Testament in Hebrew when it was translated into first Greek and then later into Latin. The word for whale was mistranslated as kito, which in Greek means sea dragon. So you tend to see a lot of sea dragons in the story. But the story of Jonah the whale is one in which, and we'll see this again come up, Jonah is seen as what's known as a typology, a foreshadowing of Christ. As a matter of fact, this is key. Christians believe that all of the stories in the Old Testament, the Judaic Bible, are basically prophecies of the coming of Christ. So in this story, what happens is that Jonah is commanded by God to go to a city, Nineveh, in order to preach the word of God. And for reasons that are not entirely clear in the Bible, he starts to do it and then he decides not to do it. He gets on a boat and leaves, shirking his duty. And while he's on the boat, the waters around the boat, when they're out at sea, go completely calm. And so the boat's not going anywhere, and this can mean death. The rest of the people on the boat seeing that the only person that's new here is Jonah, decide to throw him overboard. When they throw him overboard, a whale jumps out and swallows him whole. Jonah lives for 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale and then is spit back out, at which point he goes on to complete his task of preaching of the Word of God. This story is very similar to the story in the Bible where Christ, after being crucified, is entombed for 3 days and 3 nights before he rises and is resurrected, reborn into heaven. And so Christians believe, well, this story is just basically a parable or a what's called a typology about Christ before Christ was actually born. The imagery here is very strictly Christian, but you'll probably notice here it's basically kind of drawn from the precedents of Rome and Greece. The figures are very realistic or naturalistic with a little bit of idealism. The faces on some of these characters aren't completely carved. This will be common in that these characters sometimes all of this would have been carved in advance, and then when someone came to buy a sarcophagus, the features of the actual deceased would be carved on the exterior of these parts. So this may not have ever even been used. Close up of Jonah and the whale, for instance, or dragon. Most complicated of all of these early Roman sarcophagi of Romans who had converted to Christianity is the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus from about the middle of the 4th century CE. Junius Bassus was probably a mayor in Rome. He is certainly a very important person who has adopted Christianity. You see up at the top, typical of, let's say, a Roman triumphal arch, it's got an inscription in Latin that basically says Junius Bassus was baptized in his life and converted to Christianity. He would have been entombed here. The top has been destroyed, but there would have been more figurative drawing up here as well. It's arranged into separate registers, an upper register and a lower register here, and all of the scenes that are in here are scenes from the Christian Bible, once again represented in very naturalistic narrative form. We'll see a difference between narrative forms that are telling stories, and symbolic, or what is known as iconic form, where a much less naturalistic figure will stand in for an idea or be symbolic of an idea. So again, right in the center of this whole thing, let me grab my notes to make sure I don't get anything out of place. Right in the center, what we see, if you look at this central scene, is Jesus in the center, and his feet are resting on the head of a pagan sun god here, the pagan or sky god here, known as Celestus. This is as if what we're saying is that those earlier gods, associated with earth religions first and then celestial bodies second, have been taken over by Christianity, and Christ is now our light. He triumphs over the earlier pagan gods. On his right is St. Peter, and on his left is St. Paul, very important people in the Bible, who are receiving his word. They're actually getting scrolls from him so that they can go off and preach his word to others. On the left-hand side, notice how this is all set up very classically in between columns. It's a basic melding together, a syncretism of old Roman depictions of their own gods that you might see on the Areopagus, for instance, and Christian stories now. It's just like they replaced old Roman pagan imagery with Christian stories. Over here, we see St. Peter taken as a prisoner. Not to jump the gun here, but St. Peter was imprisoned while in Rome. It's where he starts his ministrations. He begins converting other people around him to Christianity. He'll end up dying in Rome, and St. Peter's itself is believed to be built with its altar directly over the tomb of St. Peter. St. Peter is important in this whole story because it's from Christ that Peter gets his marching orders, so to speak. He is told to go start the Christian church. Peter, you're the rock, and upon this rock I build my church, and he's going to go off and build that church or start it. He becomes known as the first bishop of Rome, or what later becomes known as the Pope, who is the bishop of Rome. So that's a way of saying that the reason that the Christian church in Rome is, authoritative is that it came directly from Christ to Peter. And then Peter, of course, went off to build that church at Christ's own direction. If you go over one more scene here on the top register, what you see is the sacrifice of Isaac. The sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham is an Old Testament story, and it's a tough one. The Old Testament is full of some pretty kind of fire and brimstone stories, and this is a big one. God asked one of his closest followers, Abraham, to sacrifice his only son, giving him no real explanation for why he should do this, just that it is the commandment of God and it is to be followed. Abraham, of course, is distraught over this, but in the end decides he will follow the word of God and gets ready to sacrifice his only son, at which point an angel comes down and stops his arm, and that's what we presume he is looking toward, something kind of stopping him or receiving his word, right before he sacrifices his son and offers up a lamb to be sacrificed instead, which, of course, fits into this whole story of Christ as the sacrificial lamb. If we go over to this side, what we see is what happens to Christ. It's two scenes that are linked together. In this one, Christ has been taken prisoner by Roman soldiers, and he is being judged by Pontius Pilate, the Roman kind of leader in Jerusalem at the time, who, of course, in the Bible lays all of this rationale for the conviction and crucifixion of Christ at the feet of the Jews, the Jewish members of the temple, the Pharisees, who want him to die. And what he's doing here is symbolically washing his hands of this whole, any kind of responsibility, although it's likely that that's a reference to baptism as well. Down below, we see other scenes from the Bible, both New and Old Testament. This is Christ arriving on a donkey into Jerusalem. Christ riding a donkey is symbolic of his humbleness, his humility, which is a big component of Christianity, being humble before God. One more scene over is an Old Testament scene of Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel was again, he's probably a Jew, almost assuredly. Obviously, we know he's a Jew, but he's understood as a kind of prophecy of Christ again, or a prophecy of Christ's divine will. He is imprisoned with lions, and God stops the lions from killing him during this kind of persecution, showing you that God has the ability to deliver all of us from difficult situations. Off one step further is again New Testament. This is St. Paul, most famous for his Gospels, but also important for his epistles, who is being imprisoned. On the other side of things, a really important story behind all of this. Coming from Genesis, this is Adam and Eve to the left, of course, of Christ's entry into Jerusalem in the Garden of Eden. And it's right after one believes they have disobeyed God's commandment. God's commandment, so you know this story if you've never heard it before, God created the world, and then he created Adam, and then he created Eve out of the rib of Adam, and he put them in the Garden of Eden, which is like an earthly paradise, filled with everything you could ever want, beautiful, filled with animals and so forth. Tells them to be fruitful and multiply, but gives them one kind of rule, said, don't do this. And think about this, right? Up here in the sacrifice of Isaac, it's pretty clear that when God gives you a commandment, it's to be followed. You don't know as much as God. You're supposed to trust in him and follow his commands. In this one, he says, don't eat out of this tree of knowledge, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And in the story, which I'm sure many of you have heard, Eve is first tempted by a serpent that comes to her and says, go ahead and eat out of this tree of knowledge of good and evil. After all, maybe God's just testing you to see if you have your own free will. Maybe you're supposed to make your own decisions, and a whole bunch of other kind of persuasive arguments. And eventually she eats out of that tree, and then she shares the fruit with Adam. Once they eat out of this tree, they realize knowledge of good and evil. And in this moment, they also realize that they don't have any clothes on, and they're quite ashamed that they have broken the will of God. And from this moment forward, this is what's called original sin. The sin of Adam and Eve of eating from the tree of good and of knowledge of good and evil. Everyone is born into the world with original sin. After they're caught here, God kicks them out, expels them from the earthly paradise of the Garden of Eden, and they have to go toil away to make a living, to get on with things. Again, from that moment forward, everyone is supposedly born into the world with this original sin that when Christ comes back to earth and sacrifices himself for us, he wipes away. He kind of creates a new covenant between man and God that says, if you follow my teachings, I've wiped away this original sin so that you all have the ability, if you're good Christians, to get into heaven, but you need to follow, my teachings, my rules. And then finally, off to the far left-hand side, you see a scene of Job in all of his suffering, the trials that God put this other saint through. A close-up of this again. You see up at the top, Christ with his head on Celestis here. Off to one side, Peter, and off to the other side, Paul, being given their marching orders. Down below, Christ's entry into Jerusalem, and Eve over here off to the side, covering herself up in her shame. Job over here in his trials, the sacrifice of Isaac up here to the left-hand side. The imprisonment of St. Peter, more from the scene of, again, the Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. On the other side, what you saw as well, right? Daniel in the lion's den down below, up above, Christ taken as a prisoner, and Pontius Pilate here looking on and wiping his hands or washing his hands clean of any responsibility. And then down at the bottom side, Paul led to his own martyrdom. Martyrdom, of course, is a powerful, powerful symbol for Christians. It's the idea of dying for one's belief in God, which, of course, if you are martyred in your belief of God, it's believed that if you're a good Christian, you go to heaven after that. Interesting thing that starts occurring in Rome in the 1st century AD and continues all the way through the 5th century CE is the development of what are known as the catacombs. And you're looking at basically Rome in the center here, and then all these lines and these little boxes here are the various catacombs that are all over the outskirts of Rome. Because Christians practiced inhumation, and because at different times Christians were persecuted, they needed places to gather together. The catacombs are both burial chambers for Christians, as well as large, what are called cubiculi, big regular openings that are places of gathering and probably worship for early Christians. There's a ton of these all over Rome. If you were to kind of line these all up, they're all carved, by the way. Let me get through here. Carved in this rock, a kind of volcanic rock that's underneath Rome in these areas that were owned by private people who were willing to either sell these underground areas to the Christians or lease them to them or just let them use them. They carved these long corridors in which you see these small burial chambers known as loculi, Loculi, and you'll see a cubiculi in a minute. So many of these that they could inhume over 3 million bodies. And I've been to these things before, and they go, we believe, between 50 and 70 miles if you were to line them all up next to each other. They're on 5 different levels, right? So they go deeper and deeper in these areas. And in some of the cubiculi, after the bones had sat in these loculi for a while, which are basically just tombs, the bones would be cleaned out to make room for other bones, and they just take all these bones and kind of neatly stack them up in a cubiculi, which is one of the strangest things you'll ever come across. There are more of these cubiculi, and you see the inhumed bodies, now just skeletal remains all the way through these. Again, places to bury the body while awaiting the judgment of Jesus on whether you're getting into heaven or not. It is a very, very persuasive religion for many people who are around Rome, particularly those that we know who came from the lower classes of Rome or who were immigrant populations in Rome from the Middle East and North Africa. Because it does come with its own kind of ready-made community, and of course it comes with this big thing that monotheism promises, which is an everlasting life to anyone who's a good believer of Christian values. So another way to put this is, if you're in Rome and life is pretty tough, you're having a really tough time making a living, everything's pretty bleak, your lifespan is pretty low, early 30s is when most people died. The promise of a everlasting, blissful life must have been quite compelling to many people. Look now at one of the churches devoted a cubiculi devoted to Saints Marcellinus and Petrus. This is what these cubiculi look like. They're basically a bigger version of those loculi, a big, huge chamber, which were probably devoted to Christians coming together and meeting in these places. They're usually plastered over, and then they painted on these in a mural form. And this is totally typical for this. You can see some areas that would have been used for storage or even the burial of various people here. The form itself is iconic, meaning it's totally symbolic. These round forms here are what are known as medallions or rondelles. A medallion or a roundel here are symbolic of heaven. Okay, any kind of round form symbolic of heaven. These smaller half circular forms are what are known as lunettes. Notice that the whole thing is set up as basically a cross, in this case an equilateral cross known as a Dao cross or a Greek cross. Later on, this will get stretched out to look like a cruciform, but that symbolizes, on the one hand, the crucifixion of Christ, and on the other hand, something that we saw all the way back with the Egyptians, 1, 2, 3, 4 cardinal points, meaning that Christ's dominion or God's dominion extends over the entire universe, right? So this is the basic symbolism of this imagery. Later on, they'll use the dome to symbolize the idea of that circle or medallion that's in the middle there in order to symbolize being in the presence of God or heaven. Within these forms, you see a whole host of religious imagery that is more or less meant to be naturalistic. It's painted in the same style as Roman wall paintings were painted, kind of schematic, fairly loose, not trying to get a ton of detail in there, or if there was, a lot of it has deteriorated over the years, but enough to recognize the figures. Anyone could recognize these things. And right in the center again, we have the Good Shepherd surrounded by his flock. Remember why this is important. It's basically a manifestation of Christ as the shepherd of us all, but also Christ as the sacrificial lamb for us all. In this case, the herd around him, these other sheep, are us who are following Christ. Surrounding this are other scenes from the Old Testament. Over here is Jonah and the whale, Jonah being swallowed by the whale over here. Down below this may be Jonah, but he looks suspiciously like Endymion, who's a Greek myth about a man so beautiful that the gods let him sleep forever. This is him resting under a gourd plant. Jonah after he gets out from underneath the whale, and then this scene that's probably broken is him going off to his ministry again. In between this are people praying. These are what are known as orant figures, O-R-A-N-T. And orant is a form of prayer that, by the way, was adopted by the Romans and frankly goes through Jewish times and many other religions where instead of doing this, putting your hands together to pray, early on, Christians and Jews put their hands out to receive the blessing of God. And so when you see someone doing this, it's them praying an orant form. Again, the Good Shepherd is in a million of these catacombs. It's the most ubiquitous image around. And here we see, again, one more of these. All the way back, it's actually an old Greek figure. It doesn't have anything to do with Christianity. It's known as the calf bearer. It's someone probably meant to be a votive offering, giving a calf kind of perpetually for all times, for as long as the sculpture lasts, symbolically to a god, probably placed in front of an altar. Same forms then get adopted by Christians to become the Good Shepherd, as we see here, here, and this one that's in your book as well. Here are thousands of these. They're all over the place. They're kind of the most prolific early Christian symbol that stands in for Christ and the idea of sacrifice and the idea of his teaching. One more, Good Shepherd, you can put them everywhere there. And then some close-ups of Jonah and the whale. This is, again, hilarious. So they have totally sacrificed the idea of naturalism. They just want to get into the story, the narrative. So this guy's standing on the water to throw Jonah out to, again, this mistranslation of whale for Quito or sea dragon that's going to eat him up. Remember, Jonah is a prefiguration or typology of Christ. And another scene from one of the cubiculi. This is Daniel in the lion's den. The story of Daniel, again, it's an Old Testament story. He's a Jewish man. He's actually the patron saint of lawyers because of another famous story of his. Is being persecuted, and God delivers him from his persecution. Now, think of how powerful this type of symbolism would be for an early Christian who's either being persecuted by the Romans or is having a really tough life, knowing that your God will protect you, love you, no matter what. Now to another cubiculum, just a big one that's in your textbook. This is the cubiculum of Leonis in the catacomb of Comedia, which is from the late 4th century, so the late 300s and so forth. We see a couple of different really important images here. We're just going to focus on these that we know most about. This is St. Peter. And when he was administering to his flock in Rome, when he had been in prison, he needed water to baptize them. And by the way, this story goes all the way back to the old stories of Moses needing water at a particular time. And Peter reaches out just as Moses had done in the Old Testament and strikes a stone with his staff, which brings water forth. And from that, he's able to baptize those people around him or purify them. Hopefully you're starting to see how syncretic these religions are. If that sounds suspiciously like the story of, Poseidon up on the Acropolis hitting the stone with his trident so as to bring water forth, these archetypal stories about the need for water and what it does and the importance of it and how it's given to us by gods and so forth, man, they turn up in so many different religions and they're all kind of borrowing from one another. We never know which one came first or which one borrowed what or whether they just happen to seize upon the same symbology, in different parts of the world. Then up above, we have a scene of Christ. And this is really important here. This becomes a standard symbol of Christ that you'll see throughout the world. It's actually one that was a part of the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus as well, in which Christ is known as what's called the cosmocrator, or the origin of all things in the cosmos. Later on, it's known as the pantocrator and so forth. Sitting up on the ceiling, hovering above you. Now, it is, on the one hand, fairly naturalistic. It looks like a human being. but it's a really schematic human being. It's just meant to stand in for the idea of Christ. As a matter of fact, on each side of him are the Greek letters A for alpha, and this form here, the Greek letter for O, omega, which are the beginning and ending letters of the Greek alphabet. Christ says, I am the Alpha and Omega in the Bible. And what that means is he's the beginning and end of all things. That God made the world, and God in the what's known as the book of Revelation and the second coming, the final judgment, will judge us all at the end of time, and we'll either go into heaven or not. It's an idea. It's an iconic image. It doesn't have to bear a likeness to anything because it's a symbol more than anything else. You are not like Christ, really. This is an idea of God. And so it's just supposed to be symbolic. As we go forward into the Byzantine era, keep this image in mind, because when those figures start looking like nothing real, remember, they're symbolic. They're not supposed to look real. They're iconic. Another cubiculum image from a Jewish cubiculum in Rome. Yes, there are plenty of Jewish cubiculum in Rome as well. This is one of the best preserved of all of these. This is the Ark of the Covenant and menorahs from a little bit earlier, the 3rd century CE. And we won't go through all of it, but you see on each side a menorah. A menorah is, of course, one of the major symbols of Judaism, held in the temple, an object that has a really long story behind it. And then in the middle, maybe the most important symbol of all, this is the Ark of the Covenant. That is the ark that was created in a very specific form, outlined in the Old Testament, in order to hold the 10 tablets of the law, or the 10 commandments that were given by God to Moses. This all exists in a niche form. Notice that there aren't any human forms in here, right? The Jews tend to stay away, for the most part, not always, we'll see an exception to this, to figurative form, and just show symbols about things that are important to them. In fact, let's go look at one of the best preserved early Jewish synagogues in Dura Europos, which, if you look at the map over here, is in modern day Syria, right here. And unfortunately, this is one of those areas that's probably been heavily damaged by all of the conflict in Syria these days. So there are 2 parts to what was found in Dura Europos, and you'll have read this in your text, but Dura Europos was, for a long time, a Jewish settlement that was then taken over by the Romans, and it was a kind of garrison town for the Romans, although remember, the Romans don't outlaw any worship of other nations, especially when you're in different parts of the world rather than right around Rome. So they allowed the Christianity and Judaism to continue. The Roman garrison was eventually overtaken by the Parthians again. Remember them from Caesar Augustus, the Augustus Prima Porta, on his armor. There was a scene of Augustus, receiving the standards back from the Parthians. They're still around in this part of the world. And when they attacked, the Romans and the people of the town completely tried to build fortifications on the outside of town by building up earth mounds, which helped to preserve these areas really nicely. So this is the first one that we're looking at, is a Christian meeting house in this part of the world in the middle of the 3rd century CE. So basically what we have here is a private little area for baptism off to the side, then a central gathering area, and then probably an area of worship over here to this side. These things started out in people's homes and then slowly probably got more codified forms as Christianity developed. Another to the, again, left-hand side, the baptismal font, meaning an area to hold water here and a place to get baptized. Over here in the center area, a school to teach people about Christianity. And then in the far side over here, where you see people gathering, a congregation place or a church in which you would face an altar and practice your Christian religion. Surviving wall paintings in the Christian meeting house are pretty heavily damaged. We don't even really know what these things are. Over here on the right-hand side, there's a lot of speculation. And you can see a better image of this in your textbook, although it's not very good. It's once again the Christ as the Good Shepherd next to a couple of very small images of what we believe to be Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, which would make sense to put those together. After all, it's because of Adam and Eve and their original sin that Christ has to come to the world to fix it all. Synagogue is a bit more complex and has a lot more imagery there, most of which we're not going to go over, but I just wanted to show you some of these things because it's so amazing. Again, these things started off as probably private residences and then developed into the synagogue. The synagogue isn't quite the same as a Christian church. A synagogue is a place to learn and to discuss and to hear from rabbis and other people who are, major theologians about their interpretations of the Old Testament, or primarily what was known as the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which are most sacred to the Jews. What you're seeing here is a plan of the space. The little kind of squiggly line across the top shows you what has been damaged, and then all of the different scenes that are depicted here. And it's one of the few places, and it was quite surprising when this was found, where you see all of these stories of the Old Testament actually depicted in a fairly naturalistic way. All in wall paintings here, with the central area being a niche in which probably the menorah was held and probably sacred scrolls from the Torah were held in here as well, surrounded by all of these images that were meant to give pictorial form to stories that anyone who's in here would have already known, right? They already knew these things inside and out, but it helps to focus your contemplation by having visual images. It helps to, really create a lot of religious fervor among the followers to see these forms take visual form. The main center, again, this niche, which has a shell on the top. Shells are symbols of purification. They get adopted for baptism in Christianity. And then up above this, a menorah on one side and probably Moses on the other side in front of the actual niche itself, which would have held all of the scrolls from the sacred spot. The scenes that are in here, again, naturalistic, meaning they look like real human beings, although we're not trying to give you all of the details here. One of the scenes is the finding of Moses, who is cast adrift and then is found as a young child. This probably derives, by the way, from Greek mythology on some of the same themes. More famously, later on, Moses, of course, saves the Israelites, delivers them from their slavery under the Egyptians, and returns them or starts them on their travels back to their promised land, modern-day Palestine and Israel, known by the Jews as Canaan. And what we see here is what's known as a simultaneous narrative again. It's 2 scenes in the same visual space showing you different moments in this narrative unfolding of the story. Over here is Moses rendered in hierarchic scale, again, bigger than anyone else in order to show his importance, holding off with his staff the the Egyptian legions here next to a scene of the ocean, which is why you have all these fish here. That's the Red Sea, which he will, of course, part in order to escape from this legion. And then you see Moses again over here, pushing his staff and letting the waters of the Red Sea come in after he has reached safe passage on the other side to drown off all the Egyptians who are following him. Up above, famously, these are most likely the hand of God, who is, again, we can't depict God because the Jews believe that would be against their second commandment, but we can depict a little bit of God, the hand of God reaching down here in order to I mean, he's the real power behind Moses. He's the one who allows him to part the Red Sea and to collapse it and to escape. Then there's a couple more of these scenes. Samuel anointing David. David, of course, is one of the first kings of the Israelites, King David. Christians actually believe that Christ and the line of Mary descend from David. And then remember that in 313, Constantine really starts the ball rolling in Rome. And what this means is that a lot of things that were practiced with very little money behind them, or sometimes in secret in the catacombs and so forth, became more visible and had more money behind them. He doesn't actually make Christianity the official religion of the empire. Remember that won't happen until the end of the century, when Theodosius announces that Christianity is the official religion. At this point, it's not, but he certainly gets the ball rolling. The things that he does that's so important is that he establishes the first St. Peter's in Rome. And you're looking at a map of Rome again here, very heavily crowded with a ton of different things in here. And he is going to place St. Peter's right amidst all of this. Peter's, like some of the earliest what are called longitudinal Christian churches, is adapted from the Roman basilica form that you saw in the Forum of, for instance, Trajan last week. The basilican form obviously had two rounded ends to it, and in this case, what you do is you just take one end off of it, the floor plan of old St. Peter's in Rome. It was replaced during the time of the Renaissance with the new St. Peter's that you've seen there. Remember, it's built supposedly over the tomb of St. Peter. It was originally what's known as a martyrium, which means parts of St. Peter, the relics of St. Peter, including his hair and other, his cloak and bones and so forth, are actually in this spot, making it a sacred site. You just take one end of the basilica off and you have a focus end now, the altar, which is the place that all Christian liturgy, all the big rituals, all the focus of attention from those who are sitting often the aisles and down the middle of the nave would watch everything. It's roughly in a cruciform shape, meaning it looks slightly like a cross, and that will be one of the major forms of the Christian early church. The big ideas that you have to remember, the big kind of parts you have to remember, is that the central area, which would have both an aisleway but also be covered with seating, is known as the nave. Then on each side of the nave, flanking it, are the side aisles. This area later on will become known as the transept. The transept is a crossing member. And then the apse end over here is the area where the altar is, and the most sacred spot of the church. This entry space is known as a narthex. A narthex is kind of a space before you enter the sacred space of the church, and usually in front of that is some type of atrium or garden or entry area. Reconstructive drawing of what we think Old St. Peter's probably looked like. Notice that it is your basic kind of post and lintel system, using wooden timbers as crossing members to create your roof up above. But just like everything else Constantine did, he's probably taken a ton of these columns from other architectural buildings in order, that were already created, just like he did with the Arch of Constantine, in order to create the colonnade that runs right down the nave. This is the nave going down the center, as well as the aisles on each side. Is where it exists in relation to one of the forums here, with an obelisk and the field of Mars and so forth. He's basically setting it up roughly on axis with old Roman sites, as if he actually believes that the Roman earlier sites are like, prefigurations or foreshadowings of Christ to come, and he wants to build upon those ideas. It's the first major church in Rome, and it starts, of course, the development of Christian ideas being canonized, being brought together, and eventually, of course, they'll all be developed into the Christian New Testament, which isn't written yet. It's just a number of different Gospels and words of Christ that are being preached in these areas. If we move over to see Santa Constanza in Rome, you're going to see a totally different kind of plan. This is pretty common on the exterior of what's known as a central plan church. This is Santa Constanza here, the round thing over here, and it's attached to Santa Agnesa, which is actually a church. This is a mausoleum or a big tomb and veneration spot for, in this case, the daughter of Constantine, Constantina. This central plan derives from old central plan churches that go all the way back to Greece and parts of the Holy World. They are parts of early Jewish synagogues as well, and they, get adopted by the Romans for Christian places of worship or places of dedication. This mausoleum is the actual tomb of Constantina, but it was also a place of worship, and it has the same parts to it. If you look at this area here at the bottom, that's a narthex, the entryway. And then you go into what's an aisle area with apses radiating on all sides. And while the altar was originally in this space, it is now more in the center space so that people can witness it from all sides as the rituals are performed in the church. The thing about this is that it's richly decorated with mosaics. Remember, mosaics are either ceramic or glass tiles that are basically cemented onto the wall to create various designs and pictures. And the entire interior of this one time was covered with either marble facing or mosaics, and now only the inner area remains. Old flora and birds and fruits and things that were used to decorate all Roman interiors are now, in this space. But interestingly, and look at this, every little dot here is a little individual tile to show birds, on water fountains and little vessels. All of these things are tied to Christian symbolism. Dominant of this is here, where you see basically grape harvesting, right? So we have all these beautiful designs, just making the space, decorating the space with birds and vines, very kind of standard Roman decoration of an interior space. But then you also see people harvesting the grapes up here above and putting them in a cart, and over here stomping the grapes into wine. The reason that that's important is very complicated, but we're just going to give a first pass to this, and later on we'll pick it up in another lecture during the Byzantine era. During the Last Supper of Jesus Christ, basically a few days before he is crucified, he brings together all of his apostles for a last meal. And in this meal, he tells them that one of them will betray him. And the other thing that happens at this last meal is that he transubstantiates, means literally turns the bread on the table into his body and the wine on the table into his blood. This is what's known as the Eucharist or the Holy Communion, this major sacrament of the Christian church. And then he offers these to people. And the idea is that if you're pure enough, if you follow Christ, if you've been baptized, you can partake of the sacrament of the Holy Communion, the Eucharistic ceremony, drink the wine that has become the blood, and eat the bread that has become his body, as if you are literally bringing Christ into yourself to infuse you. This symbolically speaks to that with the wine that is being emphasized here. And then up above is a kind of floating head witnessing the whole thing is a picture of Constantina, the memorial, this whole space is a memorial or mausoleum to her. This is our last building for today. It is a rather small, what's called a cruciform building. It's got 4 equilateral sides, known as the Mausoleum of Galla Placida. Mausoleum of Galla Placida, and a mausoleum in this case to a relative of Theodosius who converts everyone to Christianity. And in the space, once again, we have heavily decorated interior with tons of mosaic work everywhere. And as I said before, look at how this imagery has continued to be developed. This is the old Greek meander pattern that has been, used in this space. Up here we have the shell form that we saw in the Jewish synagogue in Dura Europos. Below that, in these archways, which now become symbolic of heaven, you see Christ as the Good Shepherd again, surrounded by his flock. Here, close beautification of the interior. In this case, this is meant to be the heavens. Those are all meant to be stars. It's meant to symbolize the idea that we're all, underneath the dome of heaven, underneath God, and that God is, part and parcel of all things. We see that good shepherd at the end. Christ in this case, though, doesn't just look like a shepherd. Now that the Romans have adopted Christianity, Christ starts to look like an emperor, frankly. He holds over one hand his cross, symbolic of his martyrdom. He's wearing gold and purple, which are robes dedicated to emperors, right? These are royal colors. He is the king of heaven here now. And the halo starts to show up more and more, this glowing circle of bright light around his head that actually first showed up around emperor's head to show that they were gods on earth in the image of the sun god that they worshipped. So we're starting to see old Roman ideas being developed in relation to Christianity more and more, with now Christ not just being a humble shepherd, but being king on earth, right? Being the emperor on earth, leading us all, adopting the symbolism of the colors from the old Romans and adopting the symbolism of the halo and reinterpreting these as symbolic of Christ. Well, I hope you had fun this week in the short kind of entry into early Jewish and Christian arts, and I will see you next week.